Hello, my name is John Weidner, and this is my presentation of chapters 17 and 18 of American Nations by Colin Woodard. So, chapter 17 is on Appalachia spreading west. Appalachia in particular has always been considered by historians as a people that have been identified with the frontier. Um, Appalachian is often considered occupied by the borderlanders, and borderlanders often carried out conquests themselves, moving towards the frontier as opposed to waiting for the federal government to make room for them in this new nation. So they often started moving west towards Greater Appalachia, working with the Indians there, and really making their own civilization within Appalachia. Their culture spread wider and faster than any other nation during that time in the United States. A lot of Appalachia originally came out of Virginia and other eastern states, and that group's movement from Virginia and the eastern states into Appalachia was called the Great Migration, and it was again the largest part of the Appalachian movement. And Greater Appalachia, once it started to get settled in the early 1800s or late 1700s, early 1800s, was a decidedly rural nation. The rest of the United States did not think very highly of Greater Appalachia. They considered them very slow and simple and lazy people. One of the most endearing terms in my mind when I think of the people of Appalachia is the term Hoosier, which is considered a Southern slang term for a frontier hick by Yankees and the rest of the people on the East Coast. Yet the people of Appalachia, they really wore that as a badge of honor. And even today, the University of Indiana, their sports team's nickname is the Hoosiers. So it was really a divisive image between how the people of Appalachia saw themselves and how the rest of the United States saw them. Borderlanders and who made up Appalachia, they really were different from the rest of people settled in the United States because they really wanted to be isolated. Instead of living by roads, they really put their homes in the center of their property, as opposed to the nearest entrance to the road. And whenever a new family moved within 5 miles of them, they tend to continue to move west and move away from more people because they wanted a whole lot of space. And so that was really important to them. For borderlanders, they were less reverent when it came to the typical rules of the modern church. Oftentimes visitors to Appalachian churches would say that they would see kids running around in pews and men not taking off their hats. And for them, religion was less refined. A lot of their roots came from their Scottish ancestors who held what was called holy fairs, where people would be seen really just expressing their religion by flailing and really letting the Holy Spirit possess them. And if you think about it, a lot of the roots of the Baptist and Methodist Southern Revival movement came from this style of worship that began to set itself separate within Appalachia with the Borderlanders. So that was a really other unique way that they set themselves apart. And then also Appalachia, because they were so different and more simple in terms of the way that they lived their lives, lived their religion, they really distrusted political parties and really the rest of the roots of the Yankees and the other East Coast culture. They tend to voted for people that they thought best represented their down to earth views and culture. And Andrew Jackson was the first Appalachian president, and he really helped to work towards a movement of uprooting the Native Americans that were in Appalachia at the time. In the 1740s, the Cherokee Indian Nation controlled a vast majority of what was Appalachia, and they sided with the British in the Revolutionary War because they knew that the British were really the only thing holding back settlers from taking over the Appalachia area. And so once Andrew Jackson came into power, he really did a lot to help set way for continued expansion of the Borderlanders group into Appalachia and really moving the Cherokee Nation and other Indian nations out. And a big pivotal moment for that movement of the Cherokee Nation out was when Andrew Jackson worked to push forward the Indian Removal Bill. And what that Indian Removal Bill did was it led the way for the Trail of Tears, and which pushed the Cherokee to Oklahoma and also out of Georgia, and then also led the way for the Choctaw and other Indian tribes to be eventually pushed out of Mississippi and Alabama. So one thing that's interesting about the Indian Removal Bill is that there was a very big split between the people of Appalachia in terms of how they felt about it. It was actually only a 5-vote swing in the House that ended up allowing the bill to be passed, and several very important people, including Davy Crockett from Tennessee, opposed the bill. So it was a big thing, and even though it passed, the Supreme Court actually said that the bill was unconstitutional, but Andrew Jackson and the government just ignored the Supreme Court and went ahead and continued with the removal of the Indians from Georgia to Oklahoma. So Chapter 18, the other chapter I had, focused on the Deep South spreading west. So the Deep South, a lot of what we think about the roots of Deep South culture is rooted in slavery, but up until 1830, slavery really wasn't as much of a core thing for the Deep South as we think it was. There really was almost like it feels like there was a switch that just went off, but really there's a lot of things that led to slavery being sort of like a passing fad that people dealt with, and it's sort of a thing that we acknowledge it's there, but it's we don't have to have it to where it became a very big part of religion and culture, and something that was really justified and a big way of life starting in 1830-ish. So prior to 1820, the Tidewater nation had really dominated a lot of the southern part of the continent, but as Greater Appalachia effectively doubled in size from 1789 to 1840, pulling in 4 new states. So did the Deep South, which really grew tenfold during that time, growing from 2 states to 6 states. And a lot of the reason for that exposure was a really big switch in what were the cash crops during that time period. So for the longest time in the United States, tobacco had really been the major cash crop in the South, and specifically in the Tidewater area. That was really what had established Virginia and a lot of the states, Virginia and I believe North Carolina, as that they're big producers. But as tobacco began to fade in the market, cotton really began to grow in importance. And cotton wasn't something that could grow as easily up north in Virginia and the other states in that area, whereas in the South, in the subtropical climates, it really thrived and made it a lot easier. And from 1801, the percentage of world's cotton that was grown in the deep south grew from 9% to 68%. And what's really interesting about that is that that's including the fact that the world's overall production of cotton tripled during that time period. So in addition to, really just becoming more important on the world stage, they actually just really grew a lot more than the number itself says. So that's really interesting. And then slavery really was tied to this need to help produce the cotton. And because of the importance, it really tied into religion. Slavery was justified by the religious groups in that area because they were considered inferior men, and they were really worried about losing this part of their culture, and really were worried about what would happen if all of a sudden the slaves left. Deep Southerners were very afraid of slave uprisings, to the point where the Citadel, which is one of the most established military academies in the country, was created in South Carolina, I believe, specifically so that after a failed raid on Charleston happened, to where one slave had attempted to rebel and kill the majority of the owners and transport a lot of the slaves to freedom. The Southerners decided they didn't want that to happen again, so they created the Citadel in order to train their youth to quell future insurrections. So they built one of the nation's biggest military academies out of this fear. And other things that really had a huge effect on the country at that time were built out of this fear of slave rebellions. Mississippi Senator John Quitman urged an invasion of Cuba in order to keep it from becoming a bastion of hope for escaped slaves. And both President Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan separately tried to buy Cuba after the invasions by Quitman sort of didn't come to fruition, and the presidents wanted a more safer solution to this issue, but because of various issues, those sale attempts did not go through. And in addition to that, they were looking for other solutions to grow slavery and to grow the roots of acceptance in the South. And so, as Cuba they were trying to sort of quell Cuba as this like anti-slavery paradise, really, in terms of how slaves were looking at it. Appalachian mercenary William Walker worked to actually seize control of Nicaragua to build it into an additional slave post, to where Southerners sort of considered it this like slave, holy area where it's like, oh my goodness, like, we can go from the South and send our people over to Nicaragua. And it was just an additional area for them to have that trade, is the way they were looking at it. William Walker actually became president of Nicaragua in 1856. However, he lost control of Nicaragua after contracting cholera and was not able to keep a hold. And so that didn't really go anywhere after a couple of years. And so really the U.S. was forced to turn inwardly to grow slavery in the Deep South. And because importation of slaves was banned in 1808, the Gulf states really looked to other parts of the country in terms of the tidewater in the north to get a lot of their slaves to the South. And so in the 1830s, 1840s, you saw this huge mass movement of slaves to the South. And one thing that's interesting is, the Deep South really came up against a lot of resistance from an area that, without thinking about it, most people really think of New Orleans and the southern Louisiana portion, where the sugar plantations were, as sort of looped in with the deep Southerners, but it was actually part of the French roots, and the what is the name of the country, of New France. And so the deep Southerners despised the people of New France, the Creoles, and saw them as below them. And so because of that, you really had this sort of separate group within that New Orleans area, that was very different, in terms of how they voted, in terms of how they acted. They voted Republican, and were against secession, for most of the 1800s. And so you had this very different group, just in the middle of all this deep South, that was rooted in slavery, and they did believe in slavery, but it wasn't as it was more it wasn't as controlling, to where, in New Orleans, 45% of the city's population of black people, were actually free slaves, or free black people that had been slaves, because they had the ability to buy their freedom. So slavery was a part of life in New Orleans and that part of the South, but it wasn't a controlling, all consuming aspect. So that definitely came into play against the Deep South, over the 1830s to 1860s.